Good morning. Now, this is the part where you need to participate, okay? I mean, we had a lot of very, very interesting keynotes this morning, and we thought we'll sort of open it up a little bit, have some fun as well, right? So, you guys get too serious, and when I look at all of you from here, right? Don't you think that's what we're going to do, right? Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So, the format of this session is going to be, we call it Fireside Chat. We're going to have some conversation with some two eminent speakers who's joined us here, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute as well. But the majority of the participation should come from you all. Right? So you're going to ask questions, express your opinion, whatever that is going to be, right? So, and I think Pari set it up beautifully in terms of how the disruption from technology is actually impacting the way we define work, right? The way we define professions, if you may. And this is for both individuals, all of us as individuals, as also for corporations, right? And when you look at this disruption of work, we're also going to look at in broadly three different areas, right? So one is, of course, what does it do for the industries? And I think we got some very good speakers here today who's going to deal with that. What does it do to an industry such as oil and gas or autonomous cars or automobiles and so on and so forth? Second would be, what does it do for individuals who's actually, can their jobs getting better? Are they losing the jobs and so on and so forth? That's sort of the second line of thought that we will want to talk about. And the third, which I think, which is not discussed enough, this is sort of the social issue around, what does it really mean when the jobs get redefined, when professions change? What does it mean from a social impact point of view? So these are the broad, areas that we will discuss, and we'll sort of keep it very conversational and so on and so forth. So as I said, joining me here, two eminent leaders from the industry. Anita, as introduced already, has been with Wipro for the last couple of years now already? Yeah. Okay, right. But she did work in other places as well. She was in Flextronics and TI before she joined Wipro. Very happy to have you, Anita. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
She flew in all the way from Naperville, you said? No, you said Mountain View. Yeah, Mountain View, California. So thank you for joining us today, and I think we're going to have some good discussion there as well. So next would be Nal, Nalinikanth Gollagunta. I mean, all of us have trouble saying the whole name, so we're going to call you Nal. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
Okay. So Nal is actually Managing Director and Country Head for Commercial Sales for Cisco in India. And before he joined Cisco, he spent some time with McKinsey as a leader of technology, media, and telecom. And somebody's from McKinsey, that he's going to be a consultant, so we're going to be asking you some consultant type questions.
Absolutely.
Have you ever sat with any McKinsey guys before? They always have this 2x2s. Anyway, anything is in 2x2. The world is 2x2 for them, right? So we said, no, we're not going to do any 2x2. So we're not giving Nal a slate or anything else for you to draw anything on it. But anyway, that doesn't stop a McKinsey guy from doing a 2x2 virtually as well.
Right.
But we'll see how that goes, yeah? So with that, let's get into the conversation, right? So we want to begin with this notion of saying artificial intelligence, which is sort of the broad topic we're going to be talking about. There are broadly two elements of artificial intelligence, in my mind at least, right? So one is the traditional artificial intelligence all of us know about, which tries to, in some sense, imitate human intelligence. And the second variety of that is going to be cognitive, which is actually going to augment the human intelligence. So broadly, we can sort of look at it as, the traditional AI, which does a lot of work in terms of mimicking the human intelligence and not truly building in the human intelligence in part of what they're going to do. Second one is in terms of cognitive, where it not just augments, not just mimics, but also augments the human intelligence. So, broadly, as far as from a structure point of view, I think that will help us to understand. And why is it important? It's important because it's not enough to just mimic human intelligence, because you want these machines to do a lot more than what a human being could potentially do, right? And hence, the first around, when you look at traditional AI, it's all about replacement. And the second around, it's going to be enhancing the expertise levels of what you can potentially get done. So that's the sort of the broad context, if you may. And I saw in Pari's presentation, he talked about the whole Tesla, and he didn't mention Tesla, but of course he had started Tesla, which is of course everybody's sort of the toy these days, right? Elon Musk, who's the CEO of Tesla, he once claimed, saying that driving a vehicle is too dangerous for humans and will be outlawed when autonomous cars are proven to be safer, right? So it is to that level of disruption. It's not just disrupting or can an autonomous car drive as good as a human being, as opposed to saying that it can drive a lot better. Why? It doesn't drink and drive, right, for once, right? Hopefully, we don't know, right? We'll find out in a bit. It won't drink and drive. It'll follow the rules, hopefully, and it doesn't have fatigue, hopefully, again. So, potentially the disruption is going to be multifold. It's not just about mimicking. It's not about doing what a human can do. It's going to be doing a lot more, right? So that's the sort of again, the context. And a couple of other examples which I found was interesting was that about a month ago, a company called Dina, which is the mobile company in Japan, they're introducing a robo shuttle, right? So it's almost ready, and they're going to be launching in a few days. That's pretty interesting. It was the first robo vehicle, a bus, which is actually going to be operating in Japan. So these are not, it used to be, even if you're having the same conference, having the same topic about 5 years ago, this is all sort of a virtual, okay, it potentially can happen, but today it's no longer a thing in the future. It is current, it's happening today, right? So that's the sort of the background. So with that, I know, Anita, you are involved in a lot of these autonomous car topic as your passion, as your work. What do you think is the future of these autonomous cars? And where do you see, I mean, of course, having said that, as you know, about, I don't know when it was, about a month ago or something like that, Tesla had a bad accident, about a couple of months ago, right, in Florida. They went and crashed against whatever, and then the driver died because they were actually using a driverless mode or whatever, right? So with all of that, do you see the future of when drivers will be banned, the human drivers will be banned from driving cars, and say, you're going to have that, only by an autonomous car? What's your take on that?
Rajesh, it's a very unfortunate accident. Again, like, as you said, it was originally, happened sometime in our first quarter of this year, I think in March, and it eventually was reported to the press only in July. And what happened there was the driver did not react. The car was on autopilot, and so there have been only bits and pieces of information that have come out. And what we have has been gleaned through NHTSA reports and whatever Elon Musk and Tesla themselves have reported, right? And initially they were saying, look, this was an 18-wheeler. It cut in front of a car. The camera couldn't detect the horizon, the sky, with the white vehicle, 18-wheeler that was going by. And then people started wondering why the radar didn't catch it, right? But then again, it was a very high vehicle, so the radar then mistook the vehicle for street signs as opposed to being the vehicle itself. But eventually what it comes to is that Tesla had never intended it to be a truly autonomous vehicle. The driver was always supposed to be engaged. The driver was always supposed to be driving and in control. And I think that in there is the paradox. When you give a driver a vehicle which largely brakes by itself, which largely responds, and you can see a lot of that in action, and the person who was involved was actually a very enthusiastic person that had really pushed the vehicle to the limits, written a lot of blogs about it, put up YouTube videos about it. And in the end, people speculate that the fatality was because he was watching a video at the time, because he'd gotten so comfortable with the fact that the vehicle was actually driving itself most of the time. So it's almost like a mixed doubles match where someone thinks their partner is going to get it, and then they think they're going to get it, and then neither of them take it and then drop the ball as a consequence. But ultimately in this case, what it shows us on one hand is how far autopilot has come to where a driver feels so comfortable to not take control of the vehicle when they were supposed to. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair, I suppose. I know there was a lot of sort of setback for Tesla itself because of all of that, and the autonomous part of the car itself, right? So let me just turn over to Nal, and I know we talked about how is artificial intelligence changing professions, changing industries, and you are very passionate as a consultant will always be, Nal, in terms of what you are seeing as the impact of this revolution, if you may, in the industries that you operate in. So any comments from you on
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rajesh. Rajesh, before I go into the specifics of what's happening today, just want to remind a little bit of this whole concept of automation, autonomous systems, has been around for 200 years now. It's nothing new, right? We started with steam engines. You had textile mills when automation started happening there. Then when moved from horses to cars, then when computers started coming in the 50s and 60s, we have had this conversation several times. And if you go back and look at every time, it's always been the same conversation. Millions of jobs are going to get lost. We're going to have huge unemployment issues. And every time what's been consistent is what automation has done is it has replaced pieces of activities. It has rarely displaced an entire job, okay? The point Anita was making, autonomous cars will mostly do the job, but ultimately there will be somebody who will have to maintain some part of the control of the activity itself, right? So the job doesn't go away to a large extent, right? And that's what we see today. If you look at any of the pieces that we're talking about, let's take mining, right? Mining is a place where we have seen a lot of artificial intelligence, a lot of autonomous vehicles getting into action, right? You go to Australia, most of the activity happens on the western side, where most of the mineral resources are. If you want to put a driver in a very remote part of Australia, it costs you $300,000 per driver, or $350,000 per driver. And they're fairly hazardous conditions as well. So there's a clear business case to have autonomous vehicles going in for drilling, for evacuation of the basic materials itself. But the reality is, somebody is always in the back end, either monitoring, looking at the activity, doing a bunch of other things, which are more higher value add work, which always continues to happen. So what we see is, yes, the drilling piece of it gets replaced, the driver gets replaced, but if you're able to retrain the person, he actually has a much better job in a much less hazardous situation, right? And that is what we see in every industry we look at. The business case changes every time. Mining in Australia is about autonomous. You come to India, it's about pilferage and reduction of pilferage. It's a different use case. The technology is the same. The artificial intelligence is the same. You're more worried because you have 30% of pilferage in mines, right? So you're more worried about that. The business case changes to that extent, but it's the same technology which goes behind it. And that's what we see in every industry that we're talking about as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think the industry use cases you just now mentioned varies from the rudimentary automation, you have robotics, right? And then it graduates all the way to what we call cognitive. It's almost a new era. And why is it so? So I think there are a few things which makes this cognitive era a lot more interesting than just the robotics era. And here are the reasons, right? So one, we call something a cognitive system if they understand, which means they should be able to read text, see images, watch a video, understand what's going on in the video, hear natural speeches and so on. So truly understand what's going on. So that requires cognition. Second, the reason with the purpose, right? So the reasoning is not that obvious. The reasoning comes when you are able to form an hypothesis, which is how the human brain works, right? You form an hypothesis, you choose the best hypothesis, and you go with that, right? So the ability for you to form multiple hypotheses with a bit of a probability on what is the closest hypothesis that you need to zero in on is, again, a capability of a cognitive system. The third, they also learn, right? So when they make a mistake, they learn from the mistake. When they do something which is the right thing, they learn from that as well. So that's why you do not program a cognitive system. You actually train a cognitive system, right? So the moment you're building a cognitive system, you've got to train that over a period of time, not necessarily program. So we have gone away from the programmable automation to trainable automation, which is probably the big leap, if you may. And hence we say that cognitive is more probabilistic as opposed to very deterministic. So they're not going to determine, they're not going to be saying right or wrong, but they're going to give you a probability of what it's going to be, how right you're going to be or how wrong you're going to be, right? So let me also move on to another interesting topic, which I think also the reason why I think most of these debates or the panels or the chat gets very interesting. It's about job loss and then the effect of some of that. So HFS, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. It's a small, an agency which publishes some of the reports. And we had the gentleman, the guy who ran HFS a couple of months ago in Mumbai. He was here in terms of talking about, some of the effects of automation and so on and so forth. So he recently predicted that Indian IT services industry will lose 6.4 lakhs, which is about 640,000 jobs to automation, right? So we know, most of us in some form or the fashion are involved in developing code and software and whatnot. So Anita, maybe this is more relevant to a company like Wipro, which has got hundreds and thousands of engineers doing coding every day, testing every day.
Right.
What happens? And I think the gentleman who spoke before was talking about sort of replacing, or was it Pari? I'm not sure. Talking about replacing the BPO call centers with robotics and so on and so forth. So what does it take to the software organization, people who write code and build products, build services, testing? What happens to all of them?
This has been a long dialogue going on for some time, Rajesh. I mean, as Nal mentioned, it started with the Industrial Revolution, where people thought, once you have the steam engine or you have a automated weaver, you're going to lose a lot of jobs. And you did put a lot of weavers out of work in those days. But eventually, cloth became a lot cheaper, and then there were even more factory jobs. And we've seen the same thing back to the 70s when you had sort of the feminist movements, or back to World War II when there were women coming into the workforce. And people were saying, well, with all these women coming into the workforce, there's going to be less jobs for guys. But I don't think that has materialized either. In fact, I'll speak for myself and say, I create a lot of work for people, or maybe I make more work for people than there should be. But coming on to sort of even reality of where we are today, for a company like Wipro, we're actively trying to use cognitive computing. In fact, we've come up with our own cognitive computing platform. We're actively looking to use automation technologies to reduce the work that can be done by people, but that doesn't really mean that there are fewer jobs or necessarily that we would even be hiring fewer people. What it means is that there are other things that we want people to do. The truth is, as a human animal, so to speak, none of us like to do jobs that are highly repetitive or highly predictable. We find them boring. And we'd like to do work that has a lot of variety, that has a lot of creativity to it. And as Darwin said once very famously, the survival of the species is really about the animal that's the most adaptable. And so one of the things that we see, even with cognitive computing, machines need to learn, they need time, and then they're still at this point, learn over a period of time to do more predictable things. And the creative aspects of the job, where you need rapid learning, the rapid adaptability, that's still a very human element. I mean, if you think of it in programming terms, it takes about 15, 16 years at the minimum to program the human being to do a lot of the things that we do, which is not trivial in the amount of time you need to program a machine to interact with us. Yeah.
Okay, interesting take. And again, as I said, if you take a sort of the traditional AI versus the cognitive view, probably you might have some answers there as well, right? And so how, potentially a cognitive system should be able to fill those gaps. I mean, if it's taking 12 years to build an engineer or 30 years to build a doctor, can you really shorten it using machine learning, right? So
exactly. It's a lot of judgment that we make. There's things that we call common sense, which is sometimes not so common.
Yeah. I agree. Anyway, but let me see if I can open up to the audience. Are there any questions or any comments? If you have, please do raise your hand, and there are people with mics who can come to you, and then you can potentially ask a question or make a comment. Yeah, there's somebody in the first row here. Right here. Oh, you did want to ask a question, right? Yeah. Can you give him the mic here, please? No? Okay. Please, yeah, I'll repeat your question. Would you mind introducing yourself so the people know?
Nilesh Thacker, I work for Zinnov.
Yeah.
Nilesh Thacker, I work for Zinnov. So, as we use more technology, we tend to lose some of the things we used to do as humans. For example, I should remember all the phone numbers. I don't remember a single one now. I remember phone numbers. I don't remember anymore. As we use machine learning, as computers are doing more intelligent work, are we as humans going to lose the ability to make intelligent choices or make intelligent decisions? And what does that mean? If we don't have to make decisions, are we going to start evolving into not making those decisions? And what are we going to be doing? So
very interesting. Nal, do you want to address that? And I'm going to add something to that as well. Yeah.
The short answer is yes. We lose certain abilities to do certain things. For example, with the point of sale machine coming into place, a lot of people can't even do basic additions and subtractions to that extent, right? But the reality is, what we also see is the relevance of those skills starts going down in the world to that extent. So if it is not relevant anymore because somebody else is doing it, the value of that activity or that skill also starts to go down. So it doesn't necessarily impact human development to that extent, it just becomes relevant. For example, I don't know how to sew something because I never learned, I never needed to learn to do a skill like that. But if you go back probably 120, 130 years ago, that was probably one of the important skills you had to have coming out of school or something like that, right? So to that extent, the answer is yes, you lose certain skills, but it is okay because the relevance of those skills goes away slowly as automation and AI takes over. That would be the answer.
Yeah, so just to augment that argument, if you may, I'm sure all of you heard of this Yuval Harari, and he wrote this book called *Sapiens*. And so one of his conclusion has been saying that, I'm going to read it from his quote here, right? It says, the two key attributes of human being physical and cognitive, with both being taken over by robotics, it will create a lot of what he calls useless class. Right? There's a lot of people who can't do anything. And we'll come to that in a minute when we talk about the social impact of some of this. It also has a phenomenal bearing on the education system that we're going to see. What is that you need to teach in colleges and schools will have to be very different from what it's going to be. We'll come to that in a second in our next round of discussion. But before I go there, I thought there are a few other points you probably want to address as well. You mentioned that, Nal, in your earlier discussions with me, saying that in some of the industries, I think you talked about oil and gas, how it changes the way the industry operates. Forget about the job loss or how the people react to that. But you were also having this view saying that it fundamentally changes the industry itself in some way, gets more efficient, gets more, a lot more productive than what it was before. Have any examples or thoughts around that?
Yeah, you mentioned oil and gas, so maybe I'll start with oil and gas to that extent, right? Now, if you look at that industry over the last 40 to 50 years, it's gone through a lot of changes. If you look at the oil shock which happened in the 70s, because of the oil shock, there was massive investments by a lot of countries to actually get their talent pool in that space really come up, right? And you see a burst of educational spend happen in oil and gas in the late 70s, early 80s. Now, that entire workforce started to retire in about 5 to 7 years ago, right? And this basically, the average age of an expert in that space is now close to 50 and 55, somewhere in that range. That creates unique challenges to that market because oil discovery, prospecting is an extremely judgment-based industry, Now, most of the easy-to-reach reserves have largely been found. Now, you're basically looking at offshore at this point in time. So in one side, you're looking at places which are hard to reach, which are mostly in developing economies to that extent. On the other side, the supply of expertise and talent you have is shrinking because that pool of people is starting to come down, right? And so in some ways, where the plugging is happening of the gap is through automation to a large extent. The experts are helping these tools, these deep learning systems, figure out how to do the prospecting basically automatically or in an autonomous way. So to that extent, it helps. So in some ways, yes, it has a shock on the system, but if you take an example of oil and gas, it actually is helping smoothen out the shock which would have hit the system in some ways as well, right? So the way we look at it is technology feasibility is one aspect, but it should never be looked at in isolation. You have to look at it through the lens of the economic environment it's operating in, the social environment it's operating in, and the demand supply of the labor it's operating in, right? You can't have a burger flipper machine. It's not very difficult to do, by the way, burger flipper machine. It's been there for 20 years. Still, you go to a McDonald's, most of them, there's a human person at the end of the thing, right? It's because it's way too widespread. It's there in hard to reach places. It's much easier to get a person to work for $10 an hour than to go do this. The technology exists to that extent. So it comes around to the fact that, yes, there's feasibility technically. Does it mean it'll get replaced? Not necessarily in a lot of places. And even if it does in some places, it's actually good for that industry.
Yeah, I mean, to add to what you're saying now, when you're talking about burgers and flipping burgers, I think it's really a question of the cost of machinery, cost of computing, versus the cost of labor.
Absolutely.
Right? And in California, for example, minimum wage is now pushing $15 an hour. And of course, computing is getting a lot cheaper. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually had all our quick service restaurants being cooked by robots in the near term.
Absolutely.
But the oil and gas example that you mentioned is still interesting because, as all of us, most of you know, drilling oil wells, I think there's some statistics which said only 1 out of 3 oil wells that you really drill is actually the right place and you really get productive oil out of that. So which means that it costs about $400 to $500 million to drill a well. And imagine a situation where you do have really cognitive data in terms of saying your chances of getting oil when you drill a well is, let's say, goes up even by twice. It will be humongous. The savings will be off the charts. There will be really a phenomenal amount of savings which will come because using some real cognitive systems and doing some of that.
Yeah.
So the other application, again, something that you mentioned, is about this whole changing of professions. And I think even a basic profession, or not that basic, is as a teaching. Today in schools, when they look at a classroom, they actually teach to the average. And then they'll make sure that whether you're the brightest student in the class or you're not all that bright student, you all have to sort of adjust to that average teaching. So imagine a situation where you're able to understand how each student in a class learns, and if you're able to position, or able to teach to that level of education to each of those individual students. I mean, it's possible with some level of automation, some level of cognitive thinking. It will be phenomenal in terms of how each student will learn. So it will change the paradigm of how schools will operate and how we will actually teach. So with that, the profession's changing. Again, back to Anita, right? And you had mentioned something about how the programming ecosystem is going to change. Do you see these large corporations, especially with services, whether it is the services companies or the product companies who have large workforce, do they change their profession in some sense? Do they have a different type of training, or do they have to think of, how do they really address the market, which is going to be very different from what it is today in a different way?
That's a good question also, Rajesh, because, it's very relevant to how a services company like Wipro operates, right? I've got people in my team who started their career, working for Tandem Computers at one time, for those of us who've been around and know what Tandem was in the day. And today they're working on augmented reality-based programs, really enabling versions of the Google Glass to help people repair infrastructure, things like that. So, there's really a training and retraining and adaptability of talent that happens over time. It's definitely possible. There's always, and I think increasingly more so, employers are going to have to invest in rapidly retraining their workforce, exposing them to multiple markets, exposing them to multiple technologies. They have to be willing to make that investment. The days when someone came out of college and they learned something there, they did their first job, and then they did the same thing till they retired. We're not in that day and age anymore. We're already in a very different time where we're constantly learning on the job. Some of the things, speaking for myself, the way we designed ICs when I came out of school, that's not how we do it anymore. No. Obviously the geometries have vastly changed, the tools have vastly changed. So I think that's true for us in engineering, but it's going to become increasingly true across the board. The time frames are going to shrink even further. The other thing that I want to add is convergence, right? There's so many converging technologies coming across spectrums. We're bringing knowledge and know-how we have into the healthcare space, for example, into authenticating platforms, or we're bringing something that we've done over and over again in terms of consumer electronics and human-machine interfacing, or natural language processing, and then wondering why can't we use that in a car. So I think with that convergence as well, there's going to be a lot of cross-pollination and talent training and movement. So I think that definitely makes a case to have employees more fungible and mobile and adaptable.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience or any comments? Can I get that gentleman there? Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Sri Hari. I'm from Sharp. I have 2 points for this question. One is the economics. as we know that, the wealth divide is increasing, it might increase because of the automation. That is one part of it. Second one is, will it continue to increase? Then we have a lot of people left out in developing countries now, that is where. Second one is the social impact. As you have been rightly telling, we have only 4% of the population skilled to do any job. Unlike, Western countries, more than 60, 70%. So can such automation should be a policy by government and CSR, whatever it is, so that it can get these people who are anyway not coming to the skilling arena, but use the automation to enable the rural services of these technology. It could be healthcare, it could be education. We have shortage of doctors everywhere. So should there be a policy decision rather than government just sitting and appreciating, we have the technology. So I would like you to throw some light on this.
Okay, Nal, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay, so the first question was on economic inequality to a large extent. So I'm fundamentally an optimistic guy, so I'll give a bit of an optimistic answer to this question. But what AI does, what automation does to a large extent is, it is essentially going to disrupt a lot of value chains in industries. Jobs is part of it, but it also changes value chains, which essentially means that it levels the playing field for a lot of disruptors to come. What you generally see when disruption happens and when age-old industry structures change, there's an opportunity for people who didn't have those skills at that point in time, an opportunity to actually join this new value chain and actually be part of that. ITS industry is a classic example, right? Most of the ITS giants you see today, the Indian giants, you see their founders, they all were not part of the original power base, the so-called establishment before they started. So it gave an opportunity in the new industry to that extent. And I think to that extent, there is an opportunity for that inequality to get reduced. Now, will it happen? Comes to the second question you asked. I think as we look at all these disruptions, the one difference, as you see from, if you take the steam engines or any of the other ones, they took a long time to happen. Each of these took 2 decades, 3 decades sometimes. What's different this time is, this is happening very, very fast, and the pace of change has increased dramatically. So the response from the government, which you're talking about, the response from the policymakers around retraining, around changing the educational systems, can't be at the same pace at which it has happened before. So should there be a policy put in place? Absolutely. I think there should be a forward-looking policy around retraining, about supporting the workforce when that transition happens. That's the biggest piece. I think Denmark does a good job of it. Most of the other countries are still struggling. What do you do when a person is impacted on a job because of some of these changes? How do you support him in that period of time until he gets retrained into the new role, right? Those policies have to be put in place, and that comes back to the question. So it's an absolutely important piece. So if I was to summarize, this is an opportunity to actually reduce the inequality, but then somebody needs to help that happen, and policy will be a critical piece of that.
And I'd like to
Please.
add,
Yep,
Rajesh,
go ahead.
again, like Nal, I'm also an optimist, and I see that technology has the opportunity to make a lot of the necessary services available to the broader population, whether it is education through MOOCs or access to information through mediums such as Wikipedia, or access to healthcare through digital health and so forth. The other thing I'm optimistic about is, I've read somewhere that India as a country has a population, average age of the population around 25 years. So a really young population, vast majority of the people are very young, very trainable at that age where they can be educated and trained. So I definitely think there's a need of the hour in terms of increasing access to information and increasing access to learning. Again, I'm not an economist, but you've heard about the Gini index and how when that increases to a vast extent, that's a divide. When the gap between the rich and the poor gets too high, it primes the population for some kind of revolution or things that are not exactly positive to peace and stability. So I think it behooves us as the haves to kind of, again, work with the government to do more to get more of the population on board.
And I agree. I think India has a great opportunity to take a leadership role. I mean, when it comes to any such, completely newer, equal platform type of an opportunity, I think India has taken a bit of a lead. I do not know how much we want the government to sort of step in and do this. I hear this all the time. When I travel around a little bit, and when you go to China, they say China actually grew because of the government, right? The government did a lot of support. But India is actually growing despite the government, as all of you know. So, I would be less enthused by a policy-making body, for example, right? But it is more about how the industries and the rest of us can really pull it together in some sense, right? Any other final question? Maybe take one more and then we could, gentlemen, yeah, or maybe there, yeah. One of them, whoever gets the mic first.
So I have two questions, basically, in the two different natures. The first question is...
Do you just want to introduce yourself and where you are? I can't even see where you are. Oh, okay. You want to stand up so
yeah.
people can see you?
So the first question is...
Do you have to say who you are? So that will be a good idea.
Oh, okay. I'm Patanjali from Wells Fargo.
Okay.
So the first question is about, is the current tools and technology, by seeing the growth of the disruption which is happening in the industry, are relevant to next 5 years, or we need a altogether separate tool set or a programming language for the future?
You want to take a shot?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm trying to make sure I understood the question. The question is, when you look at the next 5 years, do we have the programming languages we need in place? Do we have the right tools in place? Right. I would say only time will determine that, in the sense that a lot of what we have, we aren't utilizing them for the capability that's possible already. So there's a lot that's already possible, a lot of innovations that are already possible with the technologies that are already in place. So Nal talked about, the potential to cook food end-to-end in restaurants. It's already in place, but we don't always use it because of the cost. So I think a lot of the technologies, the tools, whether it's in software, compute power, sensors, cognitive computing software, a lot of that is already in place to do a lot of the things that we've imagined. But of course, improvements are always welcome.
So I know we ran out of time, so I'm going to just summarize and then we see if we can wrap this up, right? So I think from all the discussion that we've had, and I think you kind of articulated it very well, Nal, as well, is that work in its current form is going to change, right? It's going to change. There will be jobs which will become automated over the years and with technology and whatnot, but then it will create new jobs and create new opportunities. So while there might be a bit of a shift in the overall job ecosystem, nothing is going to go away. It's, you will probably have a better future than what it is today. And then this whole debate around whether it is human versus machine, or that's in some sense passé, because it is always human and machine which makes it even better. It's never, human is better than machine and so on and so forth. I think combined, I think it makes it a lot more interesting, as we saw from this scaling of expertise. I mean, how could you make one great specialist and a doctor in a cancer research center to sort of scale it out and treat 100,000 patients as opposed to 2 that he is doing today? So that is the scale that will be possible with a bit of help from automation and machine learning and whatnot. And you talked about some of the education system that we need to change. I think it's at the end of the day, if the schools have learned to teach people how to learn, right? Because we don't know what you're going to teach for the future. So at the very least, they should teach everyone to learn new things. I mean, if they are able to do that, I think then you probably would have done some of that. So with that, thank you so much for Nal and Anita for a very interesting conversation today. But thank you, audience, for your participation. I'm sorry we need to cut it short because actually we are about 2 minutes over time. So thank you so much, and
thank you.
welcome to the next.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.